and share the screen. Okay then, so for the end of this session of the lecture, we have covered all the anterior pituitary hormones, and now we're going to talk about the posterior pituitary and the hormones associated to it. The posterior pituitary doesn't secrete more hormones like the anterior, only secretes two hormones. One is arginine vasopressin, or also known as antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, which is also considered the hormone of love, and we will cover this. So this is what we're going to cover in the second part of this lecture. And remember, we covered the posterior pituitary, not the anterior anymore, the posterior pituitary, which is attached to the anterior pituitary gland. Just to let you know, I have sent through Nancy an ID for whoever needs to have questions. I find it better because we can talk rather than just writing. Some of the concepts are a little complicated, so it's better to explain them with the slide rather than, just doing a message written. So I think it works better. I hope you don't mind. So we're gonna start with arginine vasopressin. So again, we're gonna start with a little draw. By the end of it, you guys are gonna know all this draw of the pituitary, right? So as you can see here in green, we have the hypothalamus, extension of the hypothalamus through the infundibulum and the posterior pituitary gland. Remember, axons don't go in the anterior pituitary gland, and it comes from another embryonic tissue origin. The posterior, on the other hand, has the axons from the hypothalamus that brings the axons, and the neuropeptides are produced in the cell bodies, travel through the axons, they get modified, the hormone, and accumulate at the end in the posterior pituitary, and then they get released into the blood circulation. In the blood circulation, the posterior pituitary has two main hormones: oxytocin, which acts in the uterine muscles during parturition or the process of giving birth, and ADH or arginine vasopressin, same thing, or antidiuretic. Very, very, very important hormone because it controls the kidney tubules, and within the kidney tubules controls the osmolality of the blood, so the concentration of salts and electrolytes. Too much ADH or lack of ADH can cause severe disease, because if there is no ADH, then there is no osmolality, and then there is severe dehydration, and it can lead to death. But obviously it can be treated, but it's called as diabetes insipidus, not to get confused with diabetes mellitus, which is different, right? So the hormones of the neurohypophysis in man and also in rodents are secreted by the posterior pituitary gland, and they are named antidiuretic hormone, ADH, also called vasopressin or arginine vasopressin. And then also we have oxytocin or OT. Those two hormones will be sent to the obviously circulation and affect target organs. So the hormones of the neurohypothesis, both ABP and oxytocin, are peptide hormones, and they are really, really small compared to the other hormones, if you remember. They only have 9 amino acids, of which 7 are identical between both of them. So both proteins are really, really, really similar indeed. However, they have very different functions, although 7 of the amino acids are identical, right? The hormones are not synthesized within the gland, remember, are synthesized in the neurons of the hypothalamus. And they are in a specific hypothalamic nuclei, which are called supraoptic nuclei and paraventricular nucleus. Now, if we look at the cartoon here, again, I hope it becomes clearer. We have the paraventricular nucleus, which we studied yesterday, supraoptic nucleus that have axons that contains specialized neurons that produce ADH and oxytocin. These hormones, or precursors of the hormones, travel through the stalk from the hypothalamus through the infundibulum, and they form a tract of neurohypophyseal axons, and they finish their terminals in the posterior pituitary gland. Here is the anterior. And they produce ADH and oxytocin release. The hormones are synthesized as inactive precursors in the cell bodies and converted to active hormones within the posterior pituitary. Again, this is a very, very detailed that you want to keep for your further studies, which summarizes the 2 lectures, but is more complex, right? So here we can see all the nucleus, AVP neurons, and also the supraoptic neurons, and basically the hypophyseal tract. Now, AVP and oxytocin, the inactive hormones, are transported from the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei. They are marked here, supraoptic. Sorry, I apologize. Let me put the slide back. Supraoptic paraventricular nucleus. These axons will produce the precursor of the hormone, which will modify, travel around the hypophyseal tract, and basically release the hormones. They are then stored within the posterior pituitary until they get further release. So what is the physiology of arginine vasopressin? Very, very, very important hormone. The secretion of vasopressin hormone influences the plasma osmolality. And the osmolality is the concentration of a solvent into in the blood, in the serum, right? For example, the salts or electrolytes or whatever it's diluted in blood. So how concentrated it is very, very important, because this needs to be tightly regulated, and changes of 1% of osmolality will give you the sensation of that you need thirst and you need to be drinking more to have always the same levels of osmolality. Also, it produces the kidneys to secrete more or less water, or in the case that more water is needed, to reabsorb water from the kidneys. And this is happening at the molecular level, and we will study this shortly. The way that is it activated from the brain is through osmoreceptors in the walls of the third ventricle. Remember that the third ventricle lies here in the close to the brain in the hypothalamus. And this signals to the neurons. That's why we were talking about yesterday that the hypothalamus is indeed a sensor of external and homeostatic signals from the body, but also external. The brain sends impulses to the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei, which obviously will polarize this nucleus and result in calcium influx and into the prevent nerve terminals of the posterior pituitary and release obviously the signal of antidiuretic hormone or arginine vasopressin. Remember, it's the same name. We may call it ADH, but it's the same arginine vasopressin than ADH. Here we have again the very precise cartoon. The brain, we have the supraoptic nucleus, the paraventricular magnocellular neurons, and the hypothalamus, and baroreceptors inputs from the NTS. And this inputs the cells and tells the cells, okay, here there is too much osmolality. We need to trigger these neurons. These neurons fire and trigger the secretion of AVP from the terminals into the bloodstream. So then arginine vasopressin is released into the bloodstream and acts upon three different receptors. And depending on the receptor will have some function or another function. All these receptors are Gpcr receptors, and they can act, and they are receptor called V1, V2, and V3. And they act via IP3, and V2 acting through cyclic CMP. Now, here in this table you have the subtype of receptor, but remember that they have newer names. So forget about the old name, remember the new name, which is V1 receptor, V3 receptor, or B2 receptor. The B1 receptor is a G protein, and it works through phosphatidylinositol and calcium pathway. And then we have the G protein coupled phosphatidylinositol calcium, and the B2 adenyl cyclase and cyclic AMP. Now, these receptors are distributed in different organs where the hormones need to act upon, right? For example, the V1 receptor is in the vascular smooth muscle, in platelets, hepatocytes, and myometrium. If you don't know what is myometrium, you can look it up, but it's in the uterine wall of the female reproductive organ. The function of the V1 is vasoconstriction, myocardial hypertrophy, platelet aggregation, glycogenolysis, uterine contraction. So it works by contracting cytoskeleton and myosin. The V3 is in the anterior pituitary gland, and it releases ACTH, prolactin, and endorphins. How about the V2, which is one of the most important? It's present basolateral membranes of the collecting ducts of the kidneys and in the vascular endothelium of the smooth muscle cells. Importantly, when vasopressin binds to the B2 receptors, it activates the Aquaporin 2 receptor, which translocates to the membrane, and it works as a water channel, so water can be reabsorbed. So we will look this a little bit more into detail. So how does vasopressin regulate osmolality and electrolyte balance in the blood? So the AVP mode of action is that AVP, you have here, binds to the receptor, activates and increases cyclic MP, which activates PK, and in the nucleus, it produces the synthesis of aquaporin, right? Aquaporin goes into the membrane, and aquaporin is a channel specific for water in the collecting duct. So what happens is that this is the nephros, right, in the kidney. So if we require to have more water, right, water will enter, and then basically the urine will be more concentrated and we will keep water. It can also happen the other way around, where water is released. So this is the mechanism through AVP of maintaining the osmolality and electrolyte balance in the blood. Obviously, has to be tightly regulated biochemically and physiologically, because otherwise we would dehydrate. So stimulation of the B2 receptor causes the synthesis and translocation of aquaporins. You guys need to know this pathway. Aquaporins then go to the membrane of the kidney tubule, thus allowing water reabsorption. So this is a way physiological of the body maintaining the osmolality in the blood, plasma, and in our homeostatic system. So we have here a little schema explaining also this. So ADH binds to the B2 receptor, which basically increases cyclic IMP, activates pKa, and this will trigger a sequence of events of transcription, which will produce the synthesis of aquaporin, which will go into the membrane and allow absorption or reabsorption of water. And aquaporins, the molecular structure is known, and they act as channels of water for water to be able to enter. AVP also, as we have seen, binding to receptor 1, not the number 2, but receptor 1, has a very important function on the blood vessels and to stimulate vasoconstriction. And this is also important for the blood circulation and the vessel tone, vascular resistance, and blood pressure. And here is a very synthesized schematic of the pathway that it covers. So basically, AVP binds to the B1 receptors in the membrane, activates phospholipase C, and it produces a calcium influx, which at the end will have an effect on the kinase and will have an effect on the cytoskeleton of myosin and actin, and it will produce vasodilatation or vasoconstriction. So this is a general scheme on how the vasopressin works, right? Very important hormone, as we will study. One of the problems of pituitary and hypothalamic damage or tumors is the lack of vasopressin from the pituitary gland, because children that have this effect or adults can die from dehydration if it's not controlled. So the hypothalamus, again, it's an integrator, and it senses hyperosmolarity. Also, these inputs come from the sympathetic stimulation. Also, decreased atrial receptor firing, and a molecule that we're not going to study in this year, but angiotensin. All these signals to the hypothalamus something is happening, right? There is too much osmolarity, right? These signals to the posterior pituitary to say secrete vasopressin. Vasopressin is released into the main bloodstream, and it will act in circulation into two main receptors. One is the B2 receptor, which will affect the kidneys and will produce the blood reabsorption, fluid reabsorption, sorry. This will increase the blood volume, which in turn also will increase arterial pressure. Vasopressin at the same time will act on the blood vessels, making constriction and increase of systemic vascular resistance. So this homeostatically will regulate electrolyte balance throughout our body and will have again a positive effect on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, making the vasopressin kidney feedback loop. So let's go more into the specifics of AVP function. So AVP is released when there is increased plasma osmolality, decreased blood pressure, and this is sensed by the baroreceptors in the brain, and the actions of AVP are targeting the collection ducts in the kidneys. They increase the permeability of water, also the reabsorption of free water, and lead to vasoconstriction. So those are the main functions, very, very important functions of AVP. For example, in hypothalamic tumors where AVP is not produced because there is breakage of the posterior gland, AVP is not produced, and the risk of dying from severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance is very big, and it leads to diabetes insipidus, which we will also talk. So, just to finish the hormones of the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, we're going to talk about the oxytocin. So this will be the last of today's talk. So oxytocin synthesis and modes of action. Oxytocin synthesis increases during pregnancy, is very, very, very important for parturition or giving birth. But there is a parallel increase in oxygenase activity, so keeps the levels, right? So there is not a big spark of oxytocin. Estrogen increases the synthesis of oxytocin receptors while progesterone inhibits it. And we will go back more in detail when we study the fertility and reproduction at the end of this module. The net effect of oxytocin response during pregnancy diminishes. So during the pregnancy, it's diminished. But just at the moment of parturition, there is a big surge of oxytocin. Oxytocin acts via IP3 to cause the contraction of the muscles of the genital tract, the uterus, and the breast. So that's why it's very, very important at giving birth. But also, there are lots of studies, of behavioral studies, which show that oxytocin also helps the bonding between the mother and the child, and also the bonding between, let's say, people, right? So that's why in some instances has been named the hormone of love. So here we have the cartoon where we can see the hypothalamic production of oxytocin, which is released into the blood, and basically it targets the production of lactation by constriction of these muscles. Then suckling of the nipples produces a effect on the neurons that travel to the brain and tells the brain to produce more oxytocin, right? Also, it has an effect on the uterine contractions during pregnancy. Very, very important during the parturition and during giving birth. In fact, oxytocin hormones is used as an injection for inducing labor when the labor is delayed. Secretion of oxytocin is stimulated by stimulation of the genitals and the nipples. Oxytocin is the most important parturition during lactation. During parturition or giving birth, oxytocin causes the contraction of the muscle of the uterus to aid expulsion of the infant. So the uterus starts the contraction to help with the giving birth. Continuous stimulation of the cervix causes continued secretion of oxytocin from the pituitary gland. After parturition, oxytocin is responsible for the milk let down and expulsion of the milk. The stimulus of suckling, but there is a delay between the start of the suckling and the milk, the first milk production, okay? Because the baby doesn't start suckling immediately. However, with the suckling, there is increase in oxytocin. Also, oxytocin secretion increases during coitus, both in males and females, and plays an important role in ejaculation, sperm transport, respectively. So this is why, in some instances, oxytocin is called the hormone of love. So, oxytocin has positive feedbacks. Released in a unique positive feedback way, the more oxytocin is released, the greater the progression of the labor and the milk ejection, with results in more oxytocin release until these processes are complete. So, in this case, instead of being a negative feedback loop, there is a clear positive feedback loop. So we have this in this panel. So we have increased stretch in the uterine wall, which produces a positive feedback, which produces signals to the brain and the pituitary gland to produce more oxytocin to increase the uterine contractions. So once the baby is born, a stretch stimulus stops and there is a decrease in oxytocin and the contractions stop. So we know that oxytocin is not necessary for initiation of the normal labor, right? So the labor can happen, but it aids labor. Oxytocin may be administered, and it is administered in the cases where there are no contractions to increase and induce the giving birth. Because what happens, you can see in this draw here, if the parturition doesn't happen, it produces a lot of pressure and distress for the baby. So an injection of oxytocin is given to help with further contraction and the birth of the kid. So there is also oxytocin pharmacology, which is given as a replacement. Like other peptides, oxytocin is destroyed in the GIT if given orally. Injection or nasal spray of synthetic oxytocin are in preparation, so you can see here the oral spray. But in labor, most of the time is given as an injection. Why is it used? It is used to induce further release of the native oxytocin, labor, and to facilitate the progression on pregnancy and parturition. Other uses include to assisting in lactation and cases of insufficient milk ejection and controlling postpartum uterine hemorrhage and involution. So, with these two hormones, which are the posterior pituitary, we have finished the content of the pituitary hormones, anterior pituitary gland. We have briefly touched on their actions, although in the next lectures, the lecture tomorrow, we will be studying the diseases of the pituitary with a special focus on pituitary tumors. But from the following week, you're going to be studying each specific axis. So what I would recommend you is to, at the beginning of each lecture, go back to the slide, right, and learn a little bit of each specific axis. Let's say the ACTH adrenal axis or the thyroid axis. And each lecture will develop and go into the biochemic and the physiological role of each specific axis. So you will cover the gonadal, hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, the thyroid and the TSH and thyroid axis. I will give you the ACTH adrenal cortex axis, and so on and so forth. So what you've seen today is only the introduction of understanding the further physiology. So if you revise this for the starting of the other lectures, that will be very beneficial to you guys. So we have covered the two main pituitary, posterior pituitary, oxytocin and vasopressin, and there are no more hormones from the posterior gland. As I told you yesterday, I'm going to give you at the end of each session some questions. The answer to these questions will be uploaded in QM+, but not immediately, because I want you guys to think about the answer slowly, and not just in the moment of the lecture, because you may have photographic memory, but 2 or 3 days after. Don't look at the lecture and try to answer these questions. So we're going to read the questions together now. And then you can answer them, and you will have the right answer in the QM+. So you can self-assess yourself. So the first question is, which of the following can increase prolactin secretion? Dopamine, hyperthyroidism, somatostatin, estrogen, pituitary gland injury. I leave it to you guys to think about it. The posterior pituitary arises embryologically as from the primitive gut, primitive heart, neural ectoderm, invagination of the Radcliffe pouch pharynx, or primitive lung. Which of the following hormones is not released by the anterior pituitary gland? Thyroid-stimulated hormone, follicle-stimulated hormone, gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, growth hormone, or prolactin. Which hormone has a positive feedback mechanism? ADH, growth hormone, IGF-1, oxytocin, or LH, luteinizing hormone. Again, think about the answer and try to answer after a few days. So like this you will see how is your memory understanding of the lecture. What stimulates ADH antidiuretic hormone secretion? First, mental physical stress, nausea or vomiting, nipple stimulation, increased plasma osmolality, or increased blood pressure. Trophic hormones are hormones that act on target endocrine glands to promote hormone secretion. Which of the following is not a trophic hormone? ACTH, LH, FSH, prolactin, TSH. Which receptors does ADH bind to increase the water challenge through aquaporins in the collecting duct? V1A, V1B, B1, B2, or B3? And this is it for today, right? Please try to answer these questions on your own time. I have set up a hour ID meeting for anyone that may have some questions, which I will try to address. But just to recapitulate what we have studied today and also wrap up what we studied in the other lecture. So these lectures have covered the anatomy of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which you have to know. We have done an overview of the hypothalamic pituitary axis and the hormones, which you would need to know. We have covered the physiology, but very broad physiology, of the hypothalamic hormones, the physiology of the pituitary hormones, and we have not covered yet the pathophysiology of the pituitary hormones. You will cover this in the successive lectures, right? Tomorrow and the next week. And this is what I would expect you to know, okay? So this is a simplified slide, and this is the take-home message of all the lectures that we have done. So you need to know the simple anatomy of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, where are they located, which is the relationship to each other, and what are the main nuclei, and obviously how is it innervated and how is vascularized. Be able to give examples of the hypothalamic pituitary axis hormones, which we have covered. Explain the physiology impact of hypothalamus and pituitary, because they are the master regulators, and you need to understand this regulation to then understand what happens with the kidneys, with the liver, with the bones, with the reproductive organs, and so on and so forth. Explain the pathophysiology of the pituitary hormones, which we will cover also tomorrow, with the diseases of the anterior pituitary gland. With all this, right, I will also give you in the lecture some recommended reading and some of the papers that you can find in PubMed. And if you guys cannot find it in PubMed, you can tell me. I will post the PDFs to you in QM+. This is just extra reading for those that are more interested in this area and that perhaps want to pursue endocrine studies in their medical field. So, with having said this, I will stop the lecture and we will see each other tomorrow or later on if you have more questions. Let me stop sharing this. Close this. Thank you everyone. See you tomorrow. Oh.